The great hall of Illyris shone like polished glass. Light from the tall windows fell on the smooth floor, making it glow. Rich carpets spread down the center, guiding visitors toward the throne at the end of the hall. The air smelled of candles, clean stone, and something proud. Princess Leora sat on the throne with her chin lifted a little too high. She was only 19, but she already carried herself like someone who expected the world to bow. Her dark hair was tied with a silver band, and her dress sparkled like water under sunlight, but her eyes showed boredom. She looked down at the line of soldiers waiting to give their reports. Among them stood one man who did not look like the others. His armor was old, with scratches and even dents that had never been polished out. His face looked worn from travel and battles, but there was calm in his eyes. He was called Ethan Cole, a soldier of the Terran Vanguard. He had seen many wars and had survived through more than luck. Ethan stepped forward and bowed slightly. His voice was strong, but quiet. "Your Highness," he said, "my men have checked the northern ridge. The old passages are clear now. We built new guard towers," and Leora gave a light laugh, sharp enough to stop his words. "Clear, you say? Wonder if humans count every scratch they clean as a victory." Several nobles nearby laughed too, their laughter thin and cold. Ethan stood still, his face unreadable. She went on, resting her chin on her hand. "Tell me, soldier, is it true you never fight without that heavy armor? You fear the wind might wound you if you stand bare in battle?" More laughter rolled through the hall. Guards tried to hide their smiles. A few of the younger soldiers in the line looked at the floor in shame or anger. Ethan waited quietly for the sound to die down. Then he looked up at the princess, and though his tone stayed calm, his eyes held something deeper. "Your Highness," he said, "armor does not make the soldier, just as a crown does not make the ruler." The laughter stopped. Leora blinked, not used to being answered so directly. "Is that true?" she asked in a half-mocking tone. "Then let me see. Prove that you are more than the metal you hide behind." Ethan looked around the hall. Everyone was watching now, lords, knights, servants, even the guards at the door. Then, without hurry, he began to undo the straps of his armor. The room grew silent except for the sound of metal clicking loose. He lifted off the shoulder plates, then the chest piece, setting them down one by one. He did not rush or show pride. When at last he removed the last piece, he stood in a simple dark tunic, his arms marked with old scars. The light from the windows touched his skin and showed the history written there burns. Cuts, bruises that had long healed but not faded. The court stared at him. They saw not a shining hero, but a man who had lived through hard roads and had come back standing. "I tremble for no crown," Ethan said softly, yet his voice carried through the hall. "But the earth remembers every step I took so that others could stand safe." A hush filled the air.
Ow.
Even the princess felt her breath catch. Ethan's quiet words somehow filled the room more than her laughter ever could. She wanted to reply, but no sentence felt enough. Ethan did not wait for her to speak. He bent slightly in respect, picked up his armor pieces, and turned toward the doors. His footsteps on the marble sounded firm but peaceful, like a heartbeat that refused to break rhythm. As he walked out, many in the hall found themselves looking away, not from shame for him, but for themselves. Leora sat still, her hands clasped tightly together. The golden light now looked different to her eyes, softer, yet heavier. The sound of those footsteps stayed in her ears long after he had gone. For the first time in her young life, she wondered if pride and strength were truly the same thing. Outside, Ethan reached the palace steps and looked up at the sky. The clouds were clearing after a long morning of fog, and sunlight broke through. He smiled faintly. Behind him, the great doors closed. The hall would continue with its speeches and formalities, its endless polish and pageantry. But something had changed, something quiet yet deep. The soldier had walked out of the hall without his armor, yet he carried with him a strength no metal could match. Inside, a princess sat on her throne and felt, perhaps for the first time, the weight of respect that cannot be demanded, only earned. And so began the story that people would whisper for years to come, about the young princess who jeered at a soldier. And the soldier who answered not with anger, but by simply taking off his armor and walking away. That night, after the soldier left the hall, the grand palace felt different. The laughter that had once filled the chambers was gone. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, and even the sound of the fountains in the courtyard seemed less proud, more thoughtful. Princess Leora sat alone in her study, staring at a candle flame. The faint light flickered across her face. She was restless. No matter how many books she opened or how many letters she pretended to read, her mind went back to that moment in the Great Hall. When Ethan Cole, the human soldier, had removed his armor and walked away without a single word of anger, it had not been a grand act with swords or shouting. It had been something quieter, yet stronger. He did not defend himself with threats. He only showed truth. That truth now troubled her heart. Leora stood and paced across the soft carpet. Her silk shoes made no sound, but her thoughts roared inside her head. She remembered the look on his face, calm but certain. The court had mocked him, and yet in the end everyone had felt small beside him. She caught her reflection in the mirror. A young woman stared back, fine clothes, shining jewels, perfect hair. Yet she wondered if she truly looked like a leader. She had thought power came from titles and crowns, but now she wasn't sure anymore. There was a knock at the door. It was Sir Donovan, the old historian of the court. His hair was nearly white, and his hands shook a little when he bowed. "You asked to see me, Your Highness," he said softly. "Sit, Donovan," she told him. "You have studied many histories. You know the world better than most in this palace. Tell me what makes these human soldiers so strong. They fight even when there is nothing left to win. Why do they keep going?" The old man smiled faintly. "Because, my princess, they do not fight only for crowns or glory. They fight because they remember what pain feels like. They stand again and again, even in loss, because each scar reminds them of what they protect. To them, pain is not weakness. Pain means they tried, means they are alive." Leora listened, her expression uncertain. "And you think that soldier, Ethan, believes this?" "I think he lives it," Donovan said. "A man who can face laughter and walk away with peace, that is someone who has already won more battles than any sword could bring." He bowed again and left quietly, leaving her to her thoughts. The candle was almost burned out, but Leora did not light another. The darkness suited her, for it matched the confusion in her heart. The next morning came with golden sunlight pouring through the windows. Yet Leora still felt the weight of that night inside her. She went out to the balcony to breathe fresh air. Below, she saw soldiers training in the courtyard. Among them there was Ethan. He moved with quiet grace, no armor this time, just a plain shirt and gloves. He spoke kindly to the recruits beside him, showing them how to hold their spears properly. One of the younger boys dropped his weapon, and instead of scolding him, Ethan picked it up, placed it back in his hands, and said something that made the boy smile and try again. Leora stepped back from the balcony, thinking. She had mocked this man, yet here he was, modest, patient, strong not because of armor or title, but because of who he was inside. Later that day she found herself walking toward the training yard. She wore no crown this time, only a simple blue dress. When she reached the edge, the guard stiffened, ready to announce her, but she lifted a hand. "No need," she said quietly. Ethan noticed her before anyone else did. He stopped his teaching and turned, bowing politely. "Your Highness," he said, "to what do we owe the honor?" Leora hesitated. For once she had no clever words. "I wanted to see your work," she said simply. "I wanted to understand what you do." He gave a small nod. "Then stand with us if you wish. We are only learning to move as one. You might find it less formal than the Great Hall." For a while she watched in silence. The soldiers moved in unison, steel flashing in rhythm. Sweat and dust marked their faces, but there was no pride, only effort. They fell, stumbled, rose again. Ethan's voice guided them, steady, calm, sometimes teasing to lighten the mood. Leora had never stood so close to soldiers before. Their struggle seemed real in a way speeches in her court never had. She began to understand what Donovan meant. Courage was not the loud shouting of victory, it was the quiet rising after every fall. When the drills ended, Ethan dismissed the recruits and turned back to her. There was dirt on his hands and sweat on his brow, yet he stood at ease, without shame. "You watch closely, Princess," he said. "Did you find your answer?" She looked at the sky and then at him. "Maybe I found more questions," she said. "But but I think that is the beginning of understanding." He smiled a little. Questions are good. They keep us honest. That evening, when Leora walked back through the palace corridors, something inside her had changed. The echo of laughter from the day before no longer felt comfortable. It reminded her of her own pride, how empty it sounded, compared to the simple honor of a man who trained others with patience instead of power. In her heart, she decided she needed to learn more not from the nobles, but from those who walked and worked quietly below her throne. She did not yet know it. But this small decision would lead her into trials that would test everything she thought she knew about leadership, courage, and even herself. The days passed slowly after the princess's quiet visit to the training yard. For a time, the palace returned to its ordinary rhythm, the sound of guards changing post, the rustle of servants moving through corridors, the endless reports delivered to the royal desk. Yet beneath it all, something was changing, something that couldn't be easily seen. Princess Leora found herself paying closer attention to the soldiers and messengers who came through the gates. She asked questions about the far borders, about the empty villages left by storms, about the people rebuilding their homes. Each story opened her eyes wider. She had ruled from marble halls her whole life, yet she had never truly seen the world she spoke of so proudly. One morning, the calm broke. A rider came galloping into the courtyard with dust covering his cloak. His horse's breath came out in sharp clouds of steam. He dismounted, almost stumbling, and fell to one knee before Captain Jeered, one of the senior officers. "The ridge," he gasped. "It's waking up. The ground splits, the air burns. There's light under the stones." The words spread fast. Within an hour, they reached the throne room, where Leora sat among her council. "The ridge again," one old minister muttered. "It was sealed decades ago. This must be another false alarm." But another replied grimly, "The messenger looked half-burned, my lady. If he says the ridge burns, it burns." For years, people had whispered that the ridge to the north was not just dead rock. It was said to hide something ancient, something built long before the first city. Many thought it was only a legend. Now, it seemed the legend had woken. Leora rose from her seat. "Send a team at once," she commanded. "Who leads the first patrol?" Moments later, Captain Jeered stepped forward. "Lieutenant Ethan Cole already volunteered, Your Highness." At the sound of that name, the hall went quiet. Leora's eyes met the captain's. She didn't speak at first, only gave a small nod. "Tell him he leaves at dawn." But before the captain could turn away, she added, "I will go too." The council erupted in protests. The ministers shouted about danger, about duty, about her safety. But Leora did not back down. "I will not lead from behind walls," she said firmly. "If my people walk into danger, I will see what that danger truly is." By sunset, the camp beyond the northern gate was ready. The princess arrived dressed in practical clothes, simple and travel-worn, her hair tied back. She no longer looked like the polished figure of the royal court. Ethan met her there. His expression stayed calm, though his eyes hinted at surprise. "Your Highness," he said, "this is not a safe journey. The ridge is unstable." Leora straightened her gloves. "So is our peace, Lieutenant. I would rather face one danger than rule blind to the other." He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Very well, but stay close to the line. The ridge is not kind to wanderers." Before dawn, they set out. The landscape beyond the city was quiet, but an uneasy wind blew across the fields. The ground grew rougher as they neared the mountains, their shapes sharp and gray against a sky growing pale with morning. The further they rode, the stranger things became. The air smelled faintly of metal. The stones along the path hummed, as if whispering under their breath. The ridge itself stood waiting, its slopes covered in black rock and thin, jagged cracks that glowed faintly blue beneath the surface. When night came, Ethan gathered the group around a fire. The light flickered on each tired face, throwing long shadows across the ground. The princess sat nearby, her hands hidden under her cloak. She finally spoke after a long silence. "Do you believe the stories?" she asked him quietly. Ethan looked up from cleaning his knife. "Stories often come from truth," he said. "Something buried, something people forget to understand. What do you think lies beneath the ridge?" He stared into the fire. "Not treasure, not monsters. Maybe something people once built and then feared." Sometimes the things we make are the ones that turn against us. Leora looked toward the dark outline of the mountain. A faint light pulsed under the slopes, slow and steady, like the beat of some sleeping heart. The wind whistled through the camp as if warning them away. Some soldiers pretended not to notice, but none of them slept soundly that night. By the next morning, they reached the foot of the ridge. The glow under the stone had grown brighter. Cracks split open like veins of lightning frozen in rock. The air buzzed faintly, and their boots vibrated with every step. One of the soldiers whispered, "It feels alive." Ethan signaled for silence. He crouched near a piece of broken stone and brushed away the dust. Strange symbols were carved there, lines, circles, marks, too even to be natural. He turned to Leora. "These same symbols appear in your royal library's old records, do they not?" She nodded slowly. "They were said to belong to the first builders, the ones who shaped our lands long ago." Ethan stood, frowning. "Then it seems their work has woken again. Whatever they buried is stirring under us." Leora looked at him, her face pale, but steady. "Then we must learn how to stop it," she said. And with that, the group began their climb toward the shining cracks of the ridge, unaware that what awaited them there would test every ounce of courage they owned. The climb grew steeper with each step. The morning sun turned white behind the clouds, and a thin mist slid down the mountain like cold smoke. Loose stones shifted under every footfall. The air smelled of dust and metal, and the strange hum from within the ridge seemed to grow louder the higher they went. Ethan led the group with calm focus, scanning the ground for safe paths. Princess Leora followed close behind him, her cloak tucked tight around her arms. She did not speak much, but her eyes were sharp and watchful. Each soldier carried a small lamp, though the strange light from the cracks in the rock was enough to see by. When they reached the upper slope, the mountain seemed to breathe. Warm air rose from deep fissures below them, and faint blue sparks danced through the cracks like fireflies caught underground. The group paused near what looked like an opening, a broken archway carved long ago by hands now forgotten. The doorway led into darkness. Ethan turned to Leora. "That must be the old chamber," he said. "The one your records mentioned?" She nodded. The stories were true. The first builders placed something there for protection. But now it looks alive again. He studied the entrance, frowning. Some protections wake up angry. They stepped inside. The air turned heavy and strange, thick with warmth and the smell of burnt earth. Their lamps flickered, casting short waves of light that revealed shapes along the walls, patterns carved in the same precise style as the stones outside. The room widened into a great hollow space, filled with rows of metal pillars that disappeared into shadow. At the center stood a massive circular console covered in cracks. "This must be the heart of it," Ethan said quietly. The pillars began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The sound deepened, a dull rhythm that echoed through the chamber. The soldiers stiffened, gripping their gear. One of them, young Darren, took a step backward. "Something's moving under the floor," he whispered. Ethan pressed a hand to the console. The stone felt warm. He studied the symbols engraved along the edges, their meaning lost to time. But one pattern caught his eye, a mark like a spiral, surrounded by smaller circles. He had seen it in one of the old maps from the Royal Archive. Leora came closer and placed her hand near his. "This mark," she said, "is on every old record of the ridge. No, my ancestors never knew what it meant." "It might be a seal," Ethan replied. "If it breaks, the whole ridge could go with it." The ground shuddered, as if hearing him. Deep cracks snapped across the floor, cutting through the center of the console. A rush of hot air burst from below, knocking the nearest soldiers back. Sparks shot out, and the lights in the room flared so bright that everyone shielded their eyes. The console hummed louder, faster. The blue light turned white, and the hum changed into a roar. Ethan shouted, "Everyone out." Now, the soldiers ran for the tunnel, helping one another climb through the doorway. Small bursts of fire spat from the cracks in the wall. Leora hesitated by the console, her hair blown back by heat. She saw that the spiral mark had begun to spin slowly. It looked beautiful and deadly. Ethan grabbed her arm. "You have to go." She shook her head. "If we leave it, the explosion could reach the valley. There must be a way to stop it." "There might be," he said, "but it won't be safe." They looked around. Near the base of the console was a narrow passage that led downward, deeper into the ridge. A soft orange glow came from within, mixed with the pounding rhythm of some machine still fighting to live. "That leads to the inner core," Leora said, her voice low. "The failsafe must be there." Ethan nodded once. "Then I'll go." Leora caught his hand. "You won't survive the heat down there." He gave a faint smile. "Maybe not, but someone has to do it." The ground rumbled again, throwing dust from the ceiling. Ethan released her hand and stepped toward the entrance to the lower passage. He stripped off his chest armor, leaving only his tunic beneath. The metal would have become too hot inside the core. Leora's voice trembled. "Ethan, please." He stopped and looked back. "Tell them to keep moving. Tell them the ridge will hold." And then he walked into the glowing tunnel without another word. The light swallowed him slowly until all she could see was the faint outline of his figure descending into the heart of the mountain. Minutes passed like hours. From deep inside the ridge came sounds, clanks, bursts, and the rumble of machines. Then, suddenly, a blinding flash filled the chamber, followed by a silence so complete it hurt to hear. The trembling stopped. The glow faded to a soft, steady blue. Leora stood frozen, afraid to breathe. Then the faint sound of coughing came from the far side of the tunnel. Ethan appeared, staggering into the open air, clothes scorched and hands burned but alive. He looked at her with tired eyes and managed a small smile. "The seal's reset," he said weakly. "It won't break again." Before she could answer, he fell forward, and she caught him. She called for help, her voice trembling between command and fear. The soldiers rushed back to surround them, lifting him carefully. As they began their descent from the ridge, the sky opened and sunlight poured through the mist. The mountain no longer hummed, it rested in peace. Leora looked back one last time. The ground was cracked and silent but safe. She realized then that her people's strength did not live in crowns, palaces, or polished floors. It lived in the hearts that burned without armor, in the courage of those who walked forward into danger with nothing but faith and duty. And in that moment, for the first time in her young life, she understood what it truly meant to lead. The journey down from the ridge was slow and heavy. The air was cooler now, and the constant hum from the mountain had fallen silent. The soldiers carried Ethan carefully on a stretcher made from their own cloaks and spears. His breathing was steady but weak, his hands were burned, and his skin was pale from exhaustion. Princess Leora walked beside him the whole way. She said little, but her eyes never left his face. When the group reached the valley, the people of the border village rushed to meet them. Word had already spread that the ridge had nearly destroyed itself. The moment they saw the princess and the wounded soldier, the crowd went silent, then began to kneel one by one. Leora did not ask them to rise. She only bowed her head for a moment in respect to those who had waited in fear through the night. They built a small camp where Ethan could rest before being moved to the palace. A healer cleaned his wounds and wrapped them in cloth. Leora stayed nearby, refusing any comfort for herself. She took water to him every few hours, though her hands still trembled from the shock of what they had seen. When night fell, and the others finally slept, she sat outside the tent, staring at the faint blue glow still shining faintly from the mountain. It was beautiful, calm, almost peaceful now. The same light that had nearly destroyed her land now reminded her of the quiet strength that had saved it. The next morning, Ethan opened his eyes. The first person he saw was Leora sitting beside his bed. She looked tired, her hair tangled, her royal coat marked with dirt, but her gaze was warm and steady. "You are awake," she said, her voice gentle. Ethan blinked, then smiled faintly. "Am I still in one piece?" "Mostly," she replied with the smallest laugh. "Though you might never wear armor again, not that you seem to need it." He tried to sit up, but she stopped him with a hand. "Rest. The ridge is calm now. You've saved more than you know." He looked toward the mountain through the tent flap, and then back at her. "No one stands alone, Princess. You stayed." That made the difference. Her eyes softened. She wanted to argue, to tell him it was his courage alone that stopped the disaster. But his calm tone left her speechless. In that quiet space between them, she felt the kind of respect that no crown could command, and no title could take away. 2 days later, they began their return to the capital. The people lined the roads, cheering as the convoy passed. Soldiers saluted, children waved small flags, and old men bowed low. But it was not just for the princess they cheered, it was for the man beside her, the soldier who had faced fire without armor. When they reached the palace, Leora ordered that the celebration be held in the open square, not the grand hall. "Let everyone stand together," she said, "not high and low." Ethan, still bandaged, stood beside her as she addressed the crowd. She spoke not in the voice of a ruler, but of someone changed by truth. "My people," she began, "we have long believed that crowns and titles bring strength, but strength does not live in gold or thrones. It lives in every person who is willing to stand, even when standing hurts. When the ridge shook, it was not walls or weapons that saved us. It was courage. And courage often wears no armor." The crowd fell silent, listening not just to her words, but to the tone behind them. For the first time, the proud young princess spoke like one of them. Then she turned slightly toward Ethan, and we honor those who remind us of that. A soldier who walked into fire so that others might walk in sunlight. The cheers that followed shook the air. Ethan lowered his head in humility, unused to such attention, but Leora smiled at him, her eyes shining with pride. The moment felt larger than ceremony. It was a promise of change. In the days that followed, the kingdom itself seemed to breathe new life. The royal guards began to train beside the common soldiers. The court opened its gates to townspeople once a week so their voices could be heard. Leora wrote new orders to rebuild the villages near the ridge, making sure those who had lost their homes due to the tremors would be given new ones. Ethan recovered slowly, helping wherever he could. He refused any grand reward or new title. "I am just a soldier," he often said, smiling. But Leora always replied, "No one who walks without armor is ever just anything." One evening, months later, Ethan stood on the balcony of the royal garden, watching the sunset flame across the hills. The city below was alive with sound and laughter. Leora joined him, her presence quiet but bright as the light faded around them. "It's peaceful again," she said softly. "For now," he agreed. "Peace never stays forever. But maybe that's why we must keep walking." She looked at him, then at the horizon. "When I first met you, I thought strength meant never bending. Now I know it means standing back up, again and again." Ethan laughed softly. "Then you will make a good ruler." Leora smiled. "Not because of power, because I finally understand people like you." They stood there as the sun sank lower, both silent, both changed. Below them the city lights flickered on, one by one, like stars being born on earth. The young princess who had once mocked a soldier now carried his lesson in her heart, and the soldier who once answered with calm had found respect that needed no throne. And so their story lived on, not in songs of war or treasure, but in the quiet truth of a man who took off his armor and walked, and a young ruler who finally learned what it meant to walk beside him.